So thank you so much for inviting me here, Vasif, and thank you to all the team of SALT. It's great to be here. It's great to be in Istanbul. It's great to be at SALT. It's an institution that has inspired me and my friends in Athens, with whom I'm doing a project that I want to talk about today. But before I talk about that project, I want to kind of talk a little bit about the relationship between art and politics, let's say from the 1980s to now, very briefly, don't worry. And the focus especially on the relationship between art and political economy. So how art has positioned itself in relationship to broader developments of the economy, and particularly broader transformations of capitalism. But I want to share with you first something that my reaction to an article that I read last month on the New Yorker, which was entitled "Survival of the Richest." And it was about survivalism. It was about a bunch of high-tech executive, venture capitalists and hedge fund managers in the Silicon Valley. And they've developed this really sophisticated imagination about ways of survival in case of collapse of social structure, in collapse of society. It is called the without rule of law scenario, the WROL scenario. So they exchange these kind of tips on Facebook, or they meet in this kind of private meetings about gas mask or weapons or the airstrip or farmland that they're buying in New Zealand in case of... Wow, those... Yes. So the most amazing thing about the article is about this survival condo project, which is a big luxury condominium, kind of 15-story high, that was built into is being built into a missile silo in the middle of Wichita Desert in Kansas. And the luxury condominium has got 12 apartments. Each of one went for $3 million each. And is completely equipped to survival indefinitely. So it's got fish tanks, it's got hydroponic vegetables, it's got also very strict rules of behavior, in the sense that kind of very strict chain of commands, rotation on chores. And so when I first read this article, I thought this is pretty crazy. I mean, I would never want to share my, my next life, my future with these people in this condominium, even if apparently the window were fit with kind of artificial landscape, and so the kind of you could choose your best environment that would recreate it for you. But I thought, if I had to go and survive somewhere, I would go, for instance, to Athens, where people have been surviving for centuries, but also since 2008, every day the city comes alive again to these kind of circuits of solidarity organization that every day provide education, provide food, provide leisure, in squatted theater or in cinemas, and where the city really every day starts anew. And all these kind of organizations, most of these organizations only work occasionally. Only few of them work consistently. Some of them are open only sometimes, but nonetheless, when the electricity or water go off, which happens quite often during the day, the electricity is always reconnected, the water is always reconnected, and in places, in neighborhood where the public hospital, public health center has been closed down, emergencies are always cared for by solidarity clinics. So in a way, it was interesting that when I came to Athens to be involved in the Biennale, these experiments were, let's say, around 2011, these experiments were self-organization that sprang as a critique against the state, against corrupt state, and as a way of living outside the state or independently from the state. But already when I started as a director of the Biennale, these experiments were actually trying to look at the longer term notion of survival, something that looked like sustainability. and was a way of reconstructing, in fact, a state that it was pretty clear that was not gonna be sustainable, the crash of Syriza. So I was very interested in this idea of turning survival into sustainability. But I guess the point that I want to make with this introduction is the relationship between politics and imagination in relationship to capitalism. So I don't want to be too theoretical, but I just wanted to explain why there is this kind of photos of the dollar with Simmel philosophy of money. It was a mention to this argument of Simmel that described money and in general capitalism as social technology that transform people into some kind of flat, artificial, abstract entities. And Simmel described the quality of the modern metropolis as being literally inhabited by this kind of a eerie ghost, the kind of flat abstraction of people, very cinematic, which was also Marx's notion of capitalism, you know, this kind of turning, this kind of life, you know, this kind of deepness of life into some kind of flat and abstract surfaces. But also, more recently, someone like Jonathan Beller said that actually capitalism is really a cinematic mode of production. So the images are not only the outcome of, let's say, capitalism, this kind of superficiality, but they themselves attract attention. And so that in a way there is an implicit quality in images that capture attention and that create value out of nothing. But of course, we don't need images to do that, and I'm talking about more generally about aesthetic gesture as something that captures attention, something that recreates value. And at least in the kind of post-Duchampian context, we don't need any to make any artifact or to make any representation to create value. It's enough, you know, to put label and to recontextualize things around us. So in a way, I'm interested in the notion of artistic gesture, artistic movement, and especially this movement, political movement, that in a way are gesture of refusal of, let's say, political and economic condition, especially anti-capitalist gesture. And I'm interested in two kind of different hypotheses. One is Boris Groys in a recent book, In the Flow, that basically says that every time we have aestheticization, we have a blockage in politics. Aestheticization is a movement of neutralizing politics. And in fact, the bourgeois art was basically the outcome of the French Revolution that decided to create an artistic realm in order to freeze the movement. At the other extreme, there is the hypothesis of, let's say, John Roberts, but more recently Dave Beach in a recent book, Art and Value. And they say that basically art is an exceptional realm. So the aesthetic gesture is in fact an important moment in which human labor, human activities cannot be commodified. And they can disrupt capitalism precisely because they're realms that are not subject to commodification. So in a way, again, I'm interested in this tension between the aesthetic gesture that refuses capitalism and the aesthetic gesture that reproduces it. And I'm going to talk about three broader movement, let's say, or three broader gestures of art, artists that have tried to create oppositions to the regime or the political economic situation in which they were located. In the meantime, these photos in the background are photos that I collected in Brazil during one of my fieldworks. And there is a story attached to these photos, but for the moment I put them just as a tool of distraction. They will be in a loop, and these are photos of the archive of the company. It's a steel company where I did my fieldwork for 2 years, 10 years ago. So the first, let's say, movement that claims some kind of, I'm talking about the 80s, from the 80s onward. The first movement that interested me and that claimed some kind of anti-hegemonic stake was the artist-run spaces of the 70s. And I'm starting here because the 70s, 80s are this moment of transformation of capitalism that in a way we are still experiencing now. We are still trying to deal with that kind of moment, how to exit the moment. So here we have the claim of the artist run space across the world, let's say printed matter, Franklin Furnace in New York, Metropole, MoCA in San Francisco, Art Pool in Budapest. Here is the moment in which artists run spaces started to claim a political space independently from the state and independently from the market. So the idea here was that to escape the mechanism of standardization, let's say, of art practices, but also of commodification of art practices. And the way to do that was through cooperative structure, especially decisional structure that were cooperative, egalitarian, and also to scale down through small-scale organization that would, let's say, escape the control of the state. So the idea was very much self-determination, and there was a clear connection between the movement of self-organization, the cooperative in the educational sector, the cooperative in the labor movement, and the artistic cooperative that came up at that time. So a similar version of the same movement of rejection of state and market was repeated in the 1980s with relational aesthetic, and which Nicolas Bourreau wrote about. And here again the idea was to operate in the realm in between the market and the state. The idea was to reject the kind of clear, let's say, political narrative of class struggle or antagonism, and to create this kind of only provisional utopias, micro-utopias. And this same idea of self-organization was then very strong in the movement of the commons, which is a movement that I think is very important, and is a movement that inspired this initiative that we are setting up in Athens, which is called Laboratory for the Urban Commons. But still the commons is a problematic kind of terms, a very contradictory terms. And so the idea that basically art organization or any organization can exist between the state and the market is quite controversial and quite problematic, especially because the reach of the market, it's phenomenal. And so it's very difficult for commons really to operate functionally. But also, in all this discussion, there is also a problem of like romanticization of small-scale organization, romanticization of the issue of horizontalism. Oops, sorry. So here the assumption is that horizontal organization are better than vertical. The assumption is that small scale is better than big scale, that the informal is better than the formal, and that there are this value of solidarity, cooperation, that really exist as a kind of factor that, you know, they are taken for granted rather than being the end process of any organization. So one thing that I wanted to stress in this first, let's say, discussion of this first movement is that this, let's say, romanticization of the common, of the small scale, of the cooperative, clearly was then recuperated in the so-called new spirit of capitalism, all this idea of network, of creativity, of teamwork, of horizontalism. They were clearly reincorporated into capitalism as you know today. But also this polarization between small and big is also the characteristic, the component of, let's say, the ecology of corporate and art organization today. So we have this total split between corporate monopolies and small-scale Silicon Valley type of organizations. And this is quite important to bear in mind, because I will talk about this later in terms of Athens, especially with the presence of Documenta in Athens. But the other issue is also in terms of institutionalization of institutions. Of course, there is a long tradition of institutional discussions, institutional critique, but really institutions are necessary, like human society work out, you know, survive through institutions. The point is how you make institutional flexible enough, or quasi-institution, so that they can be, let's say, sustainable, but at the same time they're not rigid. So this discussion actually within, let's say, anthropology and philosophy is quite interesting in relationship to societies that develop ways in which they develop institutions that are flexible enough and egalitarian without being let's say rigid. So this is the first movement, the idea of the commons. The second movement is the movement towards post-Fordism. So what happened in the 70s was that this kind of cultural critique of this kind of corporate capitalism was incorporated in a moment in which capitalism was going to this contradiction. Mass production was becoming overproduction. In the West, the people had already everything they needed. There was no market. Unions were strong, labor movement was strong, and so there was a need to reorganize capitalism on a global scale. And so capitalism became flexible. And this was also the turn of the post-industrial economy. It was the moment in which, from the manufacturing, basically the economy shifted into the service industry. A lot of this shift was actually a way of reorganizing basically activities. So, for instance, let's say that Nike would produce shoes in a different way. In the North, you would have 2,000 workers designing, marketing the shoes, and in the South, you would have 80,000, 100,000 workers producing the shoes. So this invention of the post-industrial economy is also a way of reorganizing the economy globally, and especially across North and South divide. But this shift in the economy prompted artists and art organizations to reorganize themselves as well. And some of this kind of post-Fordist organization, or this kind of new art organization, embraced the notion of post-production. Again, here there's Nicolas Bourriot around. And so the idea was not to be producer, but to be bricolaire, so to rearrange, reassemble things that were already there, to focus on circulation rather than production, and to focus also on intellectual labor. There was also this idea of sampling, DJing, and some of these experiments are actually quite interesting, thinking about the critical art ensemble and the notion of electronic disturbance, this way in which people managed to hack, for instance, into systems, and in which the virtual world became a space of activism. Some of these projects, for instance, in parasitical finance, are very interesting today. There is a project that I'm trying to follow also with our activities in the Biennale. Another turn, let's say, in relationship to this move of capital to valorize rather than production, let's say, immaterial labor or service economies or the labor of cleaner or carer, was the turn, for instance, of Tania Bruguera of useful art, arte utile. So here the idea was to try to shift the realm of art and to try to create some networks of services and some networks of actions that could be actually useful in relationship to these groups that were being marginalized by the new wave of capitalism. So art had to operate within society, has to challenge the field within which it operates. It has to be site-specific and responding to specific urgencies. And more importantly, it has to turn the notion of the author into initiator and of audience into user. So art had to start to articulate itself by providing a series of services and support structure to people who have been marginalized. And the interesting thing about Tania Bruguera and her art is that still locate itself within the realm of performance, especially in relationship to the tradition of Latin American conceptualism. I'm thinking about, for instance, Boal, invisible theater. And here the notion is artivism, it's not about activism. Nonetheless, all these initiatives are also very mostly political, and it's about, for instance, setting up parties, organizations, institutions that are real and that operates as a support structure. The other development was the development of post-occupy art, which is a development that interests me because in a way relates more closely to the things that are happening in Athens, where mainly the art sector has been, let's say, involved in politics, not as artists, but as a political activist. So here, the recent discussion of strike art of McKee is really describing art as operating, describing activism as operating outside the circuits and the languages of art, and basically art as direct action, and the form of, let's say, subjectification of political, creating, raising political consciousness in the act of insurgency. So there is a lot of description of prefigurative politics, in the sense that art is a way of looking beyond the moment of activism to craft some kind of possible alternative, but also the idea of looking back, things and practices that are already there, that are existing, and give them new meaning. So it's also a moment of, let's say, consciousness raising. You know, there are people who every day practice commoning or every day practice solidarity, but in a way they have lost either strength in kind of valorizing this practice, or even awareness that actually they are creating alternative to the way in which life unfolds according to the usual rules. So here what is defined as post-occupy art is the series of basically activist wave from the Rolling Jubilee, including Black Lives Matters, that involve artists, as I said, as activists. Another kind of aspects of this involvement of art in forms of direct action was also the involvement of some mainstream museum in what Claire Bishop defined as radical museology. You know, museums that involve activists in their programming or involve in the programming discussion that are about activism. So in terms of this, some people are still very skeptical of artists becoming activists. Some people refer back to Richard Florida, who 30 years ago described the creative classes as those, creative people living in Brooklyn who would lead, the urban regeneration. Some people describe this kind of activist as, this kind of new engaged hipster curator who get involved in kind of social practices, often backed by corporate sponsorship. But on the other hand, there is also the possibility, as Gregory Chollet says, that actually there is this dark matter of artists. So there is this army of cultural workers, artists, unpaid, underpaid, who populate cities and who, they are coming out as activists. And so this is a possibility, and this is what Martha Rosler called the new mode of revolution. There are, again, it's interesting that these things come from New York, where some of this kind of art and activism overlapping gave sort of developed into some kind of corporate enterprise like Creative Time of Nato Thompson. With all the contradiction of embedding art in this kind of big shows. I'm thinking, for instance, about Kara Walker, Sugar Sphinx, this massive sculpture of a black woman that was put into this sugar domino factory, a factory that was soon to be turned into a redevelopment by Creative Time itself, and ended up to be the backdrop for the selfies of white people. And so Black Lives Matter stopped actually this kind of exhibition. So it's interesting that in a way that for now, what we know about art and activism is very much a discourse that comes from this kind of metropolis of urban centers in the north. And but the last turn of this, the last aesthetic movement I want to discuss with you is the movement of appropriating the South. So the movement in which actually people, curator and let's say artist activists realize that precisely that kind of space of action in the North was completely being cut out. And that, as Nina Montman writes in an article in 2007 called The Rise and Fall of New Institutionalism, Nina Montman, a German curator, writes, if European institutions want to survive, they really have to start to operate as this grassroots organization and this kind of quasi-organization, this kind of activist organization of the South. So in order for art to recycle, to reproduce itself within the norm of capital, we actually have to imitate this kind of grassroots organization that come out from the sort of this kind of hotbed of political radicalism. And it's in fact, it's true that in the kind of slums of the world, in Jakarta, Mumbai, Delhi, Rio de Janeiro, there are really super interesting and exciting political movements that are rooted in the cities and that have been very influential, for instance, in 2013. And it's also true that a lot of art organizations are coming out from these experiments. But of course, the problem of you know, how you replicate the South is an old problem, we know well. So the kind of this kind of the South has become again an exemplification of this kind of small-scale grassroots, and let's say not even post-40s. You know, the kind of it's a reality that didn't even catch up with industrialization, and so that's the kind of reality that we have to imitate. And I'm thinking, for instance, about all the notion of the Anthropocene, how it's been instrumentalized, for instance, in major art organization or major art exhibition. Last year there was a huge exhibition of the Anthropocene at Nottingham Contemporary, where the Latin American, you know, the sort of the indigenous societies of Latin America were become the kind of the stereotype of the ecological warriors, you know, the kind of the anti-capitalist. So there is a real problem of exoticizing the South, and also there is a real problem of actually appropriating the South through this movement. And one example is the Learning from Athens movement Documenta, that, you know, in order to learn from the South, they really relocated into the South, creating all sorts of problems, also bringing with them all sorts of, you know, corporate lawyers, brand consultant, financial experts. So in a way, from the kind of, you know, neocolonial, from the colonial ethnographic museum, we are ending up with the neocolonial cultural factory. So I guess there are a few things I wanted to flag out. First is that all this kind of artistic movement somehow have a quite simplistic view of what capitalism is, and have a very, again, Nordic-based view of capitalism. So, for instance, the notion of immaterial labor, of post-industrial labor, this is something that has very little meaning in places where, you know, in places where basically the economy is based either on very obsolete national industries or exploitative service economy of tourism industries, or this kind of massive, you know, rural to urban movement that create dispossession and mainly informal economy. So when we talk about capitalism, actually we don't really know how the economy is really diversified and is diverse. And so here the notion of post-capitalism, I think, is very interesting to realize that actually a big part of society operates not in capitalist condition. Some would say pre-capitalist and some in non-capitalist. And I was saying, you know, I was talking about Athens and about many places in the South. Is the kind of sharing economy is not something that you have to invent as a kind of strategy is something that's exists together with other forms of economy. And the other thing is also about political subject. There is a need to go back and to try to understand this relationship, for instance, between identity and class, relationship between work and exploitation. When we talk about the precariat, we talk about the cognitive working class. We actually really forget the reality of big part of people who really live in kind of everyday condition of precariousness, but not the precariousness of the cognitariat. It's not real sort of life precariousness. And then also we need to rethink the basic political concepts such as civic society, social democracies. Again, a big part of our imaginary doesn't know how to locate itself outside these kind of normal coordinates. But also the last thing is also the importance of the space and temporality of politics. So as I was saying before, the space of politics and the space of the economy are very much polarized between this kind of the corporate and the small scale. And the temporality of the economy are still stuck between the acceleration of capitalism as the kind of stasis also that creates this kind of massive movement of corporate movements. So what happens is if actually we think temporalities in different ways? What happens if we think about space in different way? With this in mind, I accepted the invitation to create and to be director of the Biennale 2 years ago, precisely because I was interested in this organization that were kind of trying to turn this kind of temporality of short-term temporality of survival into a longer-term project. There was also an interesting connection between the movement and the state, because the movement of solidarity came out the other way around. Syriza came out from the movement of solidarities, including different strands of movement like ecological activism, labor activism, women activism. So all these strands of political movement supported the state, and the state, even after it was completely discredited, continued to have links with the movement. So I was very interested in the way an art organization like a Biennale can relate itself to this scenario. And I was very intrigued by this challenge, mainly to downscale the Biennale. In fact, there was not very any reason for Athens or Greece to have a Biennale, as Victor Misiano reminded us when we invited him there. But in a way, the only reason to have a Biennale was, of course, to try to keep an art institution in Greece. But the idea was to downscale the Biennale and to, at the same time, to upscale this movement and organizations that in Athens were very active. And so the idea of the Biennale was to try to think about sustainability, both of the Biennale and of the society around it, and to turn the Biennale into a space where all these movements could come together, and we could commission small projects of this movement, and at the same time we could learn from these movements how to become democratic institutions, for instance, through an expanded board, through different kind of decisional making, or through ways of identifying priorities in commissioning or in programming that were not dictated only by the board, but could come out, let's say, through an expanded discussion. We also were very interested in forms of decommodifying the art world, so we were in touch with people that were working on digital currencies or on this kind of ways of paying workers in currencies that could be eventually translated into real money, but through a particular process that would involve a particular coming together on a political ground. So, but when I started the Biennale, the first event was this assembly that we had in November. And during the assembly, we invited around 50 groups. And we divided the assembly in several topics, like digital common, solidarity economies, cooperativism. And at the end, we had a big discussion about what should be the direction of the Biennale. But already in that moment, what happened was that this big meeting was attended by all the team of Documenta, by the two biggest art collector in Greece, with their bodyguards, with a really crazy coming together of sorts of people. And that was kind of perceived as a performative stunt. That was perceived as a gesture, which for some parts of the art world was great. So, we had a lot of coverage, as a artless biennale. But really it kind of alienated the people that I was trying to take on board. And so all the social movements and the political movements started to think that actually we were not taking them seriously, even if the assembly was already the end point of a long process of consultation with them. In fact, not only the social, we used the Bagion. There was this really iconic building, 18th century hotel in the center of Athens. I'm not meaning the commercial center or the historical center. Is the center where mainly refugees come, have been coming for several years. It was a completely derelict hotel that we kind of made it functional on 3 floors. And so we used part of the hotels to have groups on a permanent basis, artist groups, and groups of reading groups, all sorts of organizations that decided to cooperate with us, but also for starting productions of artwork, and of course organizing workshop and discussion. Anyway, this group didn't support us, and it became pretty clear that we were being squashed between Documenta and the other self-organized groups. So in a way, all these artist-run spaces, all this self-organization, there are really a lot in Athens today. There's an incredible environment of really active artist community. They didn't need us because they had Documenta. I mean, they didn't have really Documenta because Documenta was not paying them, but there was this imagination that Documenta would create a space for them, and they didn't need the Biennale. They didn't trust the Biennale also. Being without money, we couldn't offer very much. But there was the reason that I think it didn't work was that I was trying to impose on the Biennale, let's say, a skin or a form or a body of an organization that of a project that needed a different form, and in fact of a project that doesn't have a form yet. So the body, let's say, of the project that we are trying to do now with this new experiment has to form yet. So I was trying to stretch an institution that had already been formed. And so I guess that's one of the first issue is the issue when do you give form to an art institution and how you do it. What is the temporality, or when you decide that the movement becomes some kind of art institution, or that an art institution can be in relationship with the movement. So the idea of building an art institution out of the movement is really something that excited me, and I realized that the Biennale was already a kind of preconceived space. So Xenia, who was here I think a couple of weeks ago, resigned. I resigned from the Biennale, and we went back to the same organizations, and we said, okay, we are here. Why don't we together design the kind of institution or the kind of form that you think will work for you? And so we got in touch with a person who was very active in Syriza. In fact, one of the founders of Syriza, who then decided to resign from Syriza when Tsipras started to lead the party. Also the leader of the Solidarity for All movement, and the economist from Solidarity Economy, who also was working with the government and then resigned. So the five of us came together and now are trying to set up this laboratory for the urban common. And we have already we have been in conversation with this group for 1 year, and we already identified 4 projects. So one of these projects is to find the building in Athens, and considering, of course, all the dynamic and the kind of the urban dynamic of what does it mean to open a new institution in different parts of Athens, in different neighborhoods. And from 8, 10 building spaces, we have narrowed them down to 2 spaces. The other project is a project of mapping all the political organization, the political activities, especially practices of commoning and solidarity that are taking place in Athens. Then we have a project of archiving. So organizations are coming to us and are asking to record the histories of struggle, both in terms of oral history, but also in terms of images of film. And then we have a project on digital commons, which involves both digital currencies, but also this kind of ways in which, for instance, rural community can be wired up to markets, to market transaction. They can advertise the product, and also more generally to create a kind of community outside the grid, let's say. So we are starting this project, and we are gonna open in May, in June, when there will be the European meeting of all the solidarity economies in Europe. I guess the main point that I wanted to make is about what we consider as the relationship between how can art and politics be combined in such a way that art doesn't become an artistic gesture, as some kind of way of abstracting reality. How can you combine the moment of practice with a moment of prefiguration, let's say? And I guess that's, in a way, I've been kind of relying on my practice of anthropology, of doing fieldworks in places where I completely came from outside as a foreigner, and I started to slowly learn how to do things in relationship to the community. And so, you know, spending years in Brazil or years in different parts of the world was a way for me to build social relations. And so I guess the main point of what we're doing now with the laboratory is to really prioritize the building of social relations. The idea of trying to learn, for instance, a vocabulary together, a new vocabulary, or a vocabulary through which we can understand, you know, what we are doing, what kind of how to name our practices. So it's a way of looking for support or giving support, but basically it's a way of cultivating social relations. And I think that's, in a way, I don't think of myself as a curator, I don't think myself as an activist or as an intellectual, but I think the interesting thing is how to, in a way, establish a process where all these things come together. When you lead or follow processes, and from that processes you reflect, and then for that reflection you kind of reorient actions, let's say. And so the notion of fieldwork was very interesting for me to follow, also not only my research, which is my primary activity, but also in my kind of detour into kind of curating. So to finish, I want to tell you the story of these photos, which these photos come from this archive of the company where I did my fieldwork, as I said, a long time ago. I'm only now finishing the book, by the way, in which I describe that research, just to tell you how long are these processes, also writing. But when I was doing, so my fieldwork there was about to basically try to understand how this mega company, which is the biggest steel complex in Latin America, it was funded by a dictator, Vargas, in the 1940s to make Brazil self-sufficient. And he had a massive impact throughout Brazil. And of course, the company was fundamental in all the stages of Brazilian history, from the dictatorship to the labor movement. It was very central. And during my normal working day would be to go to the company and interview workers, trade union representatives, and then I would spend other part of the week by collaborating with the landless movement or other organization. So I kind of slowly mapped out the politics of the place, and I was really interested in the labor movement, in the relationship between the labor movement and Lula at the time, and Rousseff and the PT, this kind of state that came out from the movement, for the working class movement. And of course, the disillusion that created. But so one day I went to the company and I realized that the company had this massive photographic archive. And I was the first researcher to access this photographic archive ever in the history of the company. And the great thing is that the archive was not organized. So it was totally free territory for me to roam. And the nice thing is that the company had this amazing propaganda, visual propaganda department in the 1940s. And some of these films and photographs are wonderful because were made by this guy who ended up founding the Magnum Photographic Agency, really a great photographer. But then as I slowly progressed, I started to find kind of photos that were more and more unsettling. And so especially photos that concern first accidental work. Then there were dossiers about specific workers that were made with the help of the police. And then there were other photos about intervention they were making in the favelas. We were looking like some supportive intervention, but were actually act of really policing a violent relocation. None of them are here, although here you can see some kind of brief snapshot of something strange photos, like there is a photo of Hitler, for instance, and strange other upsetting photos. But so when I came across some of these photos, I was really upset, and the company gave me actually some of these photos for free, like they let me copy them. But other photos I decided to take with me without saying anything. And I took them with me, and it was really a gesture of anger. I didn't want that photo to be there. And so later, a friend of mine who was in the commission, historical commission for the study of dictatorship, got in touch with me because he knew that I had these photos, and he told me if I could give him the photos. And I said that no, I couldn't give the photos because that would be unethical to give them the photos, and to have the commission suddenly go to the company on the ground as evidence. Also because most of the photos actually were photos that were not incriminating in the sense the commission wanted, but they were really dehumanizing in the sense of the kind of subject that were shown. But the point of this is that I still have those photos. I never talked about them. I never wrote about them. I don't know what to say about them. And this is the kind of, the kind of big project, that I want to be involved in. Is I want to go back to the company. I want to sit with the archivists and say, and have a long conversation about why the company took these photos. But I guess going back in a way to our discussion is the images really don't have any kind of meaning outside the social relations, the personal relationship that you create. And so it's that kind of personal relationship that I think is really important when we consider the relationship between art and politics. Okay, thanks. Yeah. Yeah.
spoke about some art movements in Athens with Syriza, or that Syriza has become from these art movements. Do you still think that this connection is continuing, or they have split nowadays?
Between Syriza and the movement?
Yes. For example, because many seniors like Varoufakis or some others have resigned or went out of Syriza.
Yeah. Sorry, I'm going to wear my glasses so I can recognize you because I can see. Oh, okay. Yeah, I think the movement is still existing, the connection. And this is the reason why I think Greece is particularly interesting at the moment, because the government is still split, and within the government there are many people who are still maintaining contact with the movement and trying to support the movement, to direct the movement, for instance, in areas of political intervention where the government itself cannot push too much. For instance, in the area of legalization of the common, there is a strong interest in the government to push in that direction. And the government is kind of sending out these messages to the movement, but also supporting the movement in a kind of quite direct way. So the most successful, for instance, squat for refugees, which would normally be totally closed down, they are still operating, and they are all they are taking electricity and water illegally because they have been the electricity is cut down, the water has been cut out, but they're still open, and the government knows this. So there is a kind of the government is also involved in the privatization issue. So a big part of the government is interested in trying to use the empty building in Athens in such a way that they're not actually sold or privatized. There's a lot of German investors that are buying properties in Athens, and the government is keeping them out, also with some kind of legal loopholes. But the government is very interested in supporting some of these, let's say, actions.
Well, in your talk, you said that I wasn't clear that this biennial tried to bring this movement together and to see if some kind of institutional innovation can come out of it, if I didn't misunderstand. So my first question is, was this thinking coming from the Biennale itself, or was it coming from these art organizations, what you call the movement? So that's the first question. The second one is, I'm surprised that you still have belief in institutions, because your pictures, this is an institution, and institutions they somehow turn into these rather authoritarian or repressive organizations. And I was also surprised that you said 4 tasks, first of which was finding a building. If an institution starts with this task of trying to find a building, that's the end. So yesterday we were having a big debate among my friends about the 13th art biennial here, which was about public space, public art. And as you know, in 2013 we had the Gezi events. So the whole concept of the biennial was kind of evacuated. But the response of the biennial institution was very disappointing. And I don't know whether we had enough discussion here in Istanbul about this. But last night some commentators were saying that institutional reflexes to these kinds of situations are totally conservative and totally not innovative and not artistic in the sense of kind of artistic thinking. So I'm very skeptical about institutions, but then on the other hand, I love this institution that we are sitting in. so, so therefore, yes, I just want you to talk more about your belief in institutions, I guess.
So, I start with the end. I love this institution too, even if I know it very well, but I think this institution is a good way to bring it together what I was saying before, the moment of research, let's say, into what art is or what art could do, a very strong emphasis on research and a very strong emphasis of, let's say, commissioning or setting up projects that really reflect the urgencies of the time, but it's based a lot on research and a lot on this kind of theoretical reflection, even if it's not theoretical in the sense of, like academic. So, when I came here, I found there is a place that actually could be quite inspiring to think in terms of what we are trying to do in Athens. So my issue about institutions that, I mean, first I don't, as I was saying, I don't want to be too philosophical, but we are institutions, like self as a people are institutions. So how do you escape institutionalization is very difficult. It's just a process that happens. But more concretely, I guess the movement did want an institution, for instance, in Athens, because in Athens there is no a proper museum, there is not a proper space of research, and they were also actually quite supportive of the Biennale, but they were very, let's say, disillusioned with the format of the Biennale, with the kind of usual commercial format of the Biennale. And I think that what you said about Istanbul, I think is very important in the sense that myself, when I came here in Istanbul during the various Biennale, including the time of Gezi, I really realized how important it is to have really an understanding of how city work and live, and how movement articulates before you even think about the institution. So I think and I thought, especially in the last Biennale, where there was a kind of systematic way of avoiding hotspot and creating this kind of parallel reality, and I felt very, I felt there was a really good, so let's say skilled way of avoiding the problem that you actually cannot have a Biennale in a place where there is such a level of social disruption. What we are trying to do in Greece is that we are trying to understand from these groups what kind of institution they want, and they've been dealing with similar problems. I mean, the point about these groups that was mentioned at the beginning is that these groups started as groups like, let's set up a collective. And then in the last 10 years, they've become real institutions that create, that really substitute for the state in a very efficient way. I mean, if you want to raise money for a cause, you go to one of these organizations and they can raise a lot of money if they want. So there is a real efficiency, but they are not an institution yet, because they cannot, they are so dispersed that they cannot become an institution. So I think in Athens there is a really interesting moment in which actually the state, even if it is, again, there is no great faith in the state, but there are some people who in the state can allow this movement to actually come together in some kind of institution. And we are hoping to be in the kind of mediation space for them.
I want to ask you about forms of resistance currently in Athens, we have the Documenta coming, you had the Biennale that you were organizing, and it seems like the city is boiling with big events coming up. For example, here, whenever we have the Biennale, we have usually, either at the press conference or at the opening, a performative form of resistance. There has been, I think, 1 year somebody threw a dictionary to the face of the curators. It was a kind of a xenophobic attack. They said, like, why don't you speak in Turkish? I think one opening was a resistance, a performative resistance to the sponsors of the Biennale. Or an example from Berlin, there was an exhibition called Based in Berlin, was funded by the mayor, and it was celebrating the city of Berlin as the art city, and it was thanking the artists for bringing tourists to the town. And then there was a new movement called Haben und Brauchen, which meant to have and to need, and that set up a new group, which later dissolved. But I'm wondering if what kind of forms of resistance were there in Athens. I'm sure there are many, but can you give at least 1 or 2 lively examples? Thank you.
Well, one example is Green Park, which was a squad that came out from Ambrose, which was the first occupied theater performance space. And Green Park is, let's say, led by a bunch of internationally educated Greek who did performance studies, and then went back and they created this huge squad, really well organized, and they started to organize international events, very political, during the Biennale and during Documenta. And so the first thing they did, they kind of put us out of the market, you know, the Biennale, in the sense that we were trying to recruit the same people, the same organization, and they managed actually to do that in a very self-organized, way, but also with actions in the city. And the Ambrosa now is still very active too. And the second example are this group that are continuously boycotting Documenta, in the sense that Documenta at the moment doesn't have a great public, but they're also organizing to boycott it more substantially in the time of the opening. I don't know if these are actually positive examples, because in a way the kind of most of the people in Athens don't have really interest or time to deal with this let's say art moments. Like they just even avoid to go to the openings sometime. So I guess it's that moment of they're very introspective, these movements. But sometimes people, the organization like Green Park, they have also international connection, managed to create some kind of conjunction between local activism as, let's say, a more international kind of audience, or frame it in a more, let's say, performative way, so that can attract people from the art sector. But let's say that the art sector is not getting involved politically against Documenta so much. They will do it in the moment of the opening, but there's not a kind of systematic anti-Documenta action or anti-Biennale action. But they get very much involved in actions against the government. There is, like most of artist organizations are very active as political organizations. And this is a shame. I mean, it's a shame that in a way their form of activism is outside the realm of, the art doesn't involve them as activists. Yeah? Yeah, it does. It does. I mean, as I was saying, it means that we don't know, at least in Athens, what is the form of the art institution that will manage to mobilize them both as artists and as activists. And this is what we're trying to look at. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not really sure if I will be able to formulate the question, but coming coming from the commons movement and having contact with people in Greece or Italy and listening to their experiences, now we started to discuss, like, as you said, romanticizing, putting the objective, the space as objective, or solidarity or exchange economy, maybe what neoliberal state wants. It's like you are in a pressure cook, and these kind of solidarity spaces or shared economies is taking off the pressure. So there should be another objective to create another political subject, or I don't know, whatever. On one hand, we have this, and on the other hand, like we are having in Turkey, that you can find yourself in a situation, the macro politics is so wild, so violent, so big, that discussing these kind of things might look small to people, and it's getting harder to engage people. So I just wanted to ask you if you are reflecting on these kind of issues in this new project in the laboratory.
Yeah. One of the projects is really, for instance, map different meanings and practices of commoning, and because in a way there is no a clarity about what a common is, and sometimes it's really about spaces, as you said. You know, the experience, for instance, of Teatro Valle was that when the space was, let's say, legalized and stopped being the site of struggle, the absence of the space destroyed the movement. So very often are really kind of physical spaces. And the other thing is also that this romanticization of this experiment that you create new, anew every time, forgets that actually there is a lot that has been done already. That one of the priorities really to look at those practices already in the making. But yes, and then I think I read your question in terms of there is this relationship between, on the one hand, the sharing, the commoning being the way in which really most of the kind of corporate regime works through, like through appropriating these forms. But on the other hand, there is also this kind of delegitimization of this. So if you talk about commoning and you go to to a politician, they laugh at you. I mean, I'm experiencing this in my university in Goldsmith, where I'm trying to propose to create a cooperative instead of being beaten by the international competition, and the council laughed at me, saying, "We want to turn the university in a cooperative." But of course, this would be the solution. But so I think the two processes go hand in hand. But again, in Greece, it's interesting because people who came to the government and they come from this movement, they know this discussion, they know they are important. And so I think historically it's a good moment. And of course, they also know that in terms of international situation, it's something, the experiment can be done in Greece. Like, for instance, in Italy, there was the legalization of the Teatro Valle, the occupation, and there was a legal precedent that was very important. So we are also thinking about that in terms of policies. But yes, I think in a way, in terms of movement, in terms of this laboratory, has to be both skeptical about the fetishization of this kind of small scale, trying to, for instance, interact with the state, with this kind of more vertical institution, but also the idea of actually having some kind of ambition in terms of policies, or in terms of broader questions that usually all these movements are very self-enclosed. Yeah.
Giving answers to all of those questions, as an architecture student, I am really interested about the relationship you create with this movement and these activisms with the space, because it always turns out to be related with the space. And I can understand how an institution, how a space can base an idea and create a place where people can come together and then form some kinds of thoughts. But also most of the time those places turns out to be, like these institutions, turns out to be these powers rather than being a place for people to formulate and discuss their ideas. So I am very much concerned about this idea of institution turning to be a mechanism to decide on behalf of people rather than, you know, making a space for themselves to come together and then, you know, discuss their ideas. So how can you still believe in these institutions but also not be afraid from them?
Very idea of thinking about a building itself is pretty strange. You know, the idea that you already create an institution inside a box somewhere is already problematic. And in fact, we are thinking about several options. For instance, to dislocate its laboratory in different parts of the city. We are thinking, for instance, to open it in a place where there is already a kind of rundown community center in the middle of the biggest housing estate in Athens. So we are thinking together with urbanists and activists about the best location. I mean, this has been, of course, the most ambitious part of our project, because you know, we could open the Piraeus, where we are pretty sure that you know, there will be a massive regeneration of the waterfront. There are so many places where we could open it, and maybe we'll open in all these places. But the issue of democracy in terms of space is very important. I think it's probably the first question.
Well, I want to carry on thinking about space issue. I think the issue is not to create space for democracy from a democracy point of view, but it's to create emptiness. This is the solution for Gezi, for instance, to keep it empty. It's the emptiness which allows people to have imaginations and projections and expressions. So it's not a space, but emptiness. No space. Come on, guys. John.
Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, it's a very good point. I guess one of the ways in which I think about this space is I mean, the kind of this the politics of this laboratory is also to allow these spaces not to be occupied and to allow a little bit of emptiness. Yeah, it's a nice way.
I wasn't intending to ask a question. Maybe I can comment on the last bit, because also, I mean, clearly space it doesn't need to become a kind of, it's always a drawing of certain boundaries, but it can also be a kind of space where you can project desire or project other possibilities. So I think it's also a matter of thinking about space in those terms, rather than thinking of it as a kind of site of power necessarily.
Are you planning on keeping the laboratory a local experience, a Greek experience, or do you have any connections with other world, like the Turkish communities? Do you have any?
We have some, but
Out of the art world.
we have connections the focus of the laboratory is the Mediterranean. So we have a connection with Spain, with Italy, and we have some connection with Turkey, but I'm very keen to make more connections, and I think there's so many things that are similar and need to be done together. So yeah, it is essential that we keep the network expanded, especially in the Mediterranean, especially with activists. Yeah.
I think the promise of making connections is good for the finish now.
Yeah, yeah.
Thank you for
Thank you very much.
Massimiliano, and thank you for joining us.